Savannah Guthrie's husband, Michael Feldman, he took time to travel to New York City amid his mother-in-law, Nancy Guthrie's disappearance for a visit with her crew. This wasn't anything on air. This was a...
Not a little, not in the way that public figures allow themselves a carefully managed moment of emotion, something prepared and controlled, something that serves the story they want to tell. It cracked wide open, in front of millions of people who had woken up to her face every single morning for over a decade. People who trusted her in that quiet, habitual way you trust someone who is simply always there. People who felt, without quite being able to explain it, like they knew her. And in that moment, the woman who had covered wars interviewed presidents and anchored breaking news through some of the most chaotic and disorienting events in modern history. She could not hold it together. That was what made it so striking, not the tears themselves, but the fact that it was her. Nobody said the obvious question out loud, but everyone felt it, what exactly had brought her here. Because the tears were real, the pain behind them was real. But the story everyone thought they knew, the picture-perfect life, the thriving career. The devoted family quietly anchoring everything behind the scenes, that story had far more running beneath it than anyone could see from the outside. Layers of it, and the person who held the key to those layers had, until very recently, chosen to say nothing at all. Michael Feldman had been quiet. Deliberately, consistently, almost conspicuously quiet. For someone married to one of the most visible women in American media, he had mastered the art of staying just outside the frame, present enough to be real, absent enough to be protected. But silence, when it finally ends, has a way of being louder than anything that came before it. He spoke. And what came after that silence, what it revealed about their years together. About what had been quietly unfolding behind the warmth and the morning smiles, that is the story worth telling properly. There is something particular about the kind of fame that grows out of breakfast television, something that other forms of celebrity simply cannot replicate. A late-night comedian earns your laughter. A movie star earns your admiration, but a morning anchor earns something softer and more durable than either of those things. She earns your trust in a quiet, almost private way. You see her before the day has really started, before the armor goes on. You watch her while the coffee brews and the kids argue about shoes and the morning light is still pale and uncertain. Over years and years, that presence becomes something almost domestic, something that feels, even though you know it isn't, like a relationship. Savannah Guthrie built that kind of trust slowly and genuinely. Over her years on the Today Show, she became one of the most recognized and deeply respected faces in morning television, not through controversy, not through spectacle, but through consistency. She was warm, but she was sharp. Approachable, but with a lawyer's instinct underneath and a journalist's edge that surfaced when it needed to. She had covered some of the most consequential stories of her generation, and she had done it with a steadiness that made her feel, to the people watching, like someone who simply did not panic. Not even when everything around her was. That steadiness was not an accident. It came from somewhere real, and she had always been honest about where. She had not slid easily into the life she eventually built. Before the anchor desk, before the household name and the morning rituals, there was a woman working her way through a legal career, then deliberately pivoting into journalism. Building something from very little. She had spoken openly about faith being a central part of how she moved through the world, not as a performance for an audience, not as a public relations strategy, but as something genuine that oriented her when things got difficult. That detail matters more than it might seem, because when the hard things came, and they did come and they came hard, it was that foundation she returned to, again and again. Michael Feldman entered her life at a particular point in it. He was a political consultant by background, someone who had navigated that specific Washington world where influence and access and careful strategy all blur into each other. He was not looking for the spotlight. In fact, everything about how he conducted himself suggested that he was genuinely, not performatively, uninterested in it. Which in the world Savannah inhabited, a world built from cameras and public narrative and constant visibility, was quietly unusual. Refreshing, even. They married in 2014. She was in her early 40s, he was a few years older, they had 2 children, and by every visible measure they built exactly the kind of life that people on the outside tend to call blessed. Warm. Grounded, real, but the outside, of course, is a very particular vantage point. For years the picture held, and it held convincingly. Savannah Guthrie was not just successful, she was beloved, and those are not the same thing. Plenty of people in television achieve success through controversy, through friction. through the kind of edge that keeps audiences hooked even when they're not entirely sure they like what they're watching. That was never her. Her audience genuinely liked her. They trusted her. The warmth she projected on screen was not something assembled in a media training session. It read as real because it was real. And that kind of authentic warmth in that particular medium is rarer than it looks. Michael Feldman occupied a completely different kind of space alongside her. He appeared at events when it felt natural. He was photographed occasionally. He surfaced briefly in the soft biographical moments that morning television personalities share with their audiences. The holiday glimpses, the family milestones. The small windows into ordinary life that studios use to deepen the feeling of connection between anchor and viewer. But he was never seeking that visibility. He was always slightly to the side of it, present but not performing. On the surface, it seemed like it worked. The very public spouse and the genuinely private partner. A balance that allowed the domestic space to stay protected while still sharing enough of it that audiences felt included. It is a dynamic that works for some public couples, but inside that picture, things were not as simple as they appeared to be. There is a specific kind of pressure that builds quietly over time when one person in a marriage carries enormous public visibility and the other does not. The rhythms are different. The demands are different. The emotional texture of each day is different. The labor of existing in that asymmetry, of always being on the edge of someone else's public life without fully inhabiting it, of being important but invisible, can wear on a relationship in ways that are nearly impossible to articulate but very easy to feel. It accumulates slowly, like water finding its level. Savannah had spoken over the years about the practical weight of her schedule, 4 a.m. wake-ups that weren't occasional but daily and permanent. The kind of bone-deep exhaustion that doesn't fully lift even when it eases. The constant, relentless requirement to arrive completely, to be present and sharp and warm and curious, regardless of whatever was happening in the rest of her life. She talked about balancing motherhood with that career with honest humility. She never pretended it was seamless, but she never suggested it was breaking her either. She carried it. She kept going. And yet, underneath all of that steadiness, something was beginning to shift. There are moments in any long public career where the audience catches something they were not meant to see. Not a scandal, not a confession, just a crack in the surface. A pause that runs slightly too long, a response that doesn't land quite the way it normally would. An absence that nobody officially acknowledges, but that attentive people notice anyway, because attentive people always notice. For Savannah, those moments began to emerge slowly, then with increasing frequency. She had already been open about a significant medical experience that had genuinely marked her. The partial loss of vision in one eye caused by an injury had not simply been a physical event. It had been, by her own accounts, a deeply disorienting one. She had spoken about what it meant to face potential permanent vision loss while continuing to work, to parent 2 young children, to hold together the structure of a life that required her full presence in it at all times. She described leaning hard into her faith during that period. She described real fear, not performed for the camera, but genuine and quiet and human. And that vulnerability, shared carefully and with emotional honesty, revealed something important about who she was beneath the professional composure. She was not someone who processed difficulty entirely in private. When things got hard enough, she turned outward, she opened up, she let people in. Which made the sustained silence around what was happening in her personal life feel, to those paying close attention, all the more striking. Because at some point, it became clear that something had shifted in the texture of how she and Michael were discussed, or more precisely, not discussed. The deliberate privacy that had always surrounded him began to feel different. Less like a personal preference, more like a careful management strategy. According to various accounts in the media at the time, questions were being raised about the state of the marriage. Nothing confirmed, nothing that crossed the line into official territory. But the kind of persistent, low-level narrative that tends, once it starts circulating, to have at least some grounding in something real. Feldman remained silent. Savannah remained professional. And the audience did what audiences always do. They read the space between the words. There is a very specific kind of emotional labor that people in Savannah Guthrie's position carry every single day. It is the kind that people who haven't done it cannot fully imagine, no matter how much they try. You do not get to have bad mornings, or if you do, they have to be finished and fully processed by 4 a.m. Because the moment that camera light turns on, you have to be somewhere else entirely. You have to be warm and present and genuinely curious and fully human. For millions of people who are depending on you without even quite realizing they're depending on you, to give them something steady to begin their day with. The discipline that requires is not small. And what it means in practice is that whatever is living in your chest that morning, whatever grief or confusion or fear or exhaustion has followed you through the dark hours before dawn, it gets compressed. Pressed inward, not denied exactly, not pretended away, but deferred, set aside for later. Except that later is always another early morning, and so the compression doesn't release. It just accumulates quietly without announcement. People who observed Savannah closely during the period, when reports about her marriage were beginning to surface, noticed something they struggled to name precisely. Not a change in her professionalism that never wavered not once, but something in the softer edges, in the brief moments between segments. In the occasional fleeting quality of someone carrying something heavier than usual visible for just a second before it disappeared back behind the composure. And then came the moment. On air during a segment that was never meant to carry the weight it ended up carrying, something moved across her face, then into her voice. And for a few seconds, the composure that had held for so many years through so much, it simply gave way. She was in tears, real ones, visible ones. The kind that don't perform themselves and cannot be called back once they arrive. The audience, the same audience that had watched her through breaking news and interviews and the ordinary remarkable rhythm of a decade of mornings, understood immediately that this was different. This was not the controlled emotional response of a professional deliberately sharing something difficult with her viewers. This was something that had come through despite everything. Something that had been waiting, and the question that followed it was the one that always follows moments like that. What exactly was underneath this? Silence in public life always communicates. It speaks even when it says nothing. Michael Feldman's silence had been not just consistent but total. He did not comment on the circulating reports. He did not appear publicly in ways that might reinforce a particular image of the marriage. He did not issue statements. He did not speak to journalists, sympathetic or otherwise. He simply stayed out of the story, which, paradoxically, made his absence itself a kind of presence, more conspicuous in some ways than a brief neutral statement would have been. When he finally spoke, it landed. According to reports at the time, Feldman's remarks, made in a setting that was relatively contained but not entirely private, addressed the reality that had been slowly accumulating in the background of their shared public life. He acknowledged in the careful, measured way of a man who had spent a long time preparing himself to speak honestly, that things between him and Savannah had changed. That the relationship had passed through something real and significant, something that required honesty to name, even when naming it was difficult. He did not assign blame. He did not characterize her or their history in ways that were sharp or pointed. He spoke with the language of someone who had clearly thought hard about what to protect even in the act of finally telling the truth. And the effect of hearing the person who had been silent for so long finally speak, it was significant, because it confirmed what many had already quietly sensed. That behind the polished, warm, reliable surface of a visible and successful life, something genuinely difficult had been unfolding. Not a scandal in the sensational sense, not a dramatic rupture, but the slow, exhausting, very human process of two people trying to navigate what happens when a life they built together begins to ask hard questions about where it is going next. Savannah's public response was characteristically measured. She did not amplify the narrative. She did not position herself for sympathy in the way that many public figures do when their private lives become part of the public conversation. She acknowledged what needed acknowledging. And then she went back to work, back to the desk, back to the 4 a.m. mornings and the live broadcasts and the millions of people who depended on her without knowing they did to be steady. But she carried it. Anyone watching closely enough could see that she carried it. The simplest version of this story would end with a clean arc. The difficulty, the revelation, the resolution, the lesson neatly packaged. But life, particularly the kind of life that exists partly in the open and partly behind closed doors, does not usually cooperate with clean arcs. It resists them because that is not how things actually work. What made Savannah Guthrie's situation genuinely complicated was not just the nature of what she was going through, but the specific, unrelenting context in which she was going through it. She was not a private person enduring a private difficulty. She was one of the most recognizable women in American media, continuing to show up every single morning for an audience of millions. while the personal foundation she had spent years building was being quietly examined and perhaps rebuilt. In real time, without pause, there is a particular kind of loneliness that lives inside that, even surrounded by colleagues, even watched by millions. Even held up by a faith she had spoken about openly and returned to honestly. There is something isolating about having to perform stability when stability itself is the very thing in question. When the ground you are standing on is the ground you are also trying to repair. According to various reports, she and Feldman were working through the question of what their relationship would look like going forward, not with hostility by most accounts but with the careful, tired honesty of two people who had shared a great deal and were trying to understand what was actually true between them now. No official statement resolved the matter cleanly. No public announcement drew the chapter to a close. Questions remained open about the marriage, about what had shifted, about what the future held for both of them. No official conclusion has been reached, and the matter has remained, in important ways, unresolved in the public record. And in that unresolved space, something unexpectedly human became visible. The Savannah Guthrie who appeared on that screen every morning was never a symbol. She was never simply an image. She was a person, a complicated, faithful, exhausted, determined, deeply human person. With fears she rarely named out loud and grief she managed before the rest of the world woke up. And the fact that her audience could catch glimpses of that, even through the careful and consistent professionalism, meant that what they felt toward her was not projection. It was recognition. Michael Feldman, in choosing to break his silence, had not resolved anything. He had complicated it, in the way that honest speech always complicates things that have been quietly held together by the absence of it. And in doing so, he made it impossible to keep looking at either of them through the simplified lens that public life tends to offer. There is a point in any long story where the question stops being about what happened and starts being about what it means. What this story reveals slowly, without announcing itself, is something about the invisible cost of a visible life. About the particular weight carried by people who have built their entire professional existence on being present for others, sometimes at the real expense of being fully present for themselves. Savannah Guthrie gave her mornings to millions of people for years. She showed up through physical injury, through personal fear, through all of the ordinary and extraordinary pressures that accumulate over a life lived at that pace. She did it with grace. She did it without complaint. She did it because it was who she was, and then in one unguarded moment the grace slipped, not because she was weak, but because she was human, and human things, real ones, true ones, eventually find their way to the surface regardless of how carefully or how long you have managed them. Michael Feldman's silence had been its own form of communication all along. And his decision to finally speak was, in its own quiet way, an act of respect, not just for the people who had been watching and wondering, but for the reality of what had actually been happening. There is something worth acknowledging in the choice to name a difficult truth rather than maintain a comfortable fiction, even when the fiction would have been far simpler for everyone involved. What comes next for both of them remains genuinely open. No clean resolution has been publicly confirmed. No statement has arrived to close the chapter in the way that public narratives usually require. And maybe that is actually the most honest part of all of this. The simple acknowledgement that some things do not resolve on a timeline that suits the people watching from the outside. What we can say clearly is this: a woman who built something remarkable kept building it even when the ground beneath her was shifting. And a man who had stayed deliberately silent for a very long time finally chose honesty over the easier comfort of staying quiet, which is, when you sit with it, one of the more genuinely difficult things any person can do. The tears were real. The love, whatever shape it was taking in that particular season, was real. The difficulty was real. And sometimes, not always, but sometimes, that is the only conclusion that actually means anything. If this story stayed with you, if something in it felt familiar or true or worth thinking about, share what it is in the comments below. These are the conversations worth having. The quiet, honest ones about what we carry privately and what we finally choose to say out loud. If you want more stories told this way, slowly, carefully, without rushing toward an easy ending, subscribe and stay with us. There is always more worth telling properly.